You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by, that's right, every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man. We're Han Solo this week after a great Thanksgiving and a good start to the holiday season. We ended up taking Thanksgiving week off, which pushed back Mondays because we didn't collect articles that week for the newsletter, but we're back and we have a lot to share this week with you all, and I'm looking forward to doing that. Also, as we do when we're Han Solo, we like to share some of the episodes that are coming up on Talking Headways, the Thursday podcast that we put out every week. And let's talk about some of the ones we released since we actually last put out the Monday show. We chatted with Ben Goldfarb about his book Crossings. I hope folks get a chance to listen to that episode and also get the book. It's really great. Last week, we actually had Tom Brennan on of Nelson Nygaard about bus speed and reliability, talking about that. It's a really, really great episode for those thinking about those little things that can make a big difference in bus operations. And I know that we talk about how we can make transit more efficient. And I think these are some of the basic things that you can do from a capital standpoint to focus on that. And I think there's lots of really cool stuff that Tom brings up in the show. So hopefully folks get a chance to listen to that one. Next week, this coming week, actually, I should say on Thursday, Ron Brooks will be joining us to talk about transit access for people with disabilities. It's a super great episode, and I hope you guys enjoy it too. He also had alongside him his seeing eye dog, so have a question about them as well, which is was really interesting to hear Ron's answer on that. We also just sat down last week with Shima Hamidi, Dr. Shima Hamidi, to talk about her team's research on lane widths and traffic safety, which is a huge groundbreaking study, and it was a super popular article that people read. People are really excited about this study and what we can learn from it, and definitely be on the lookout for that episode as it comes out, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, but we'll see. We also talked with Congressman Blumenauer again at the after the Impact show, after the Impact conference, I should say, and that was a great chat as well. We've also got more episodes coming up from the Impact conferences. Also, make sure to listen to them first on the Impact podcast, which is something that I co-produce with folks at Impact. And you can find that on your podcatcher of choice. We play those episodes about a month later after they come out on the Impact podcast. So if you want a sneak peek at what's coming out there, what's coming out here in the future there, go to the Impact podcast and check that out. It's a really great, really great preview for things that are coming out here later, and you can get more of Talking Headways. We've also got some more episodes coming over, the crossover episodes. We did a recent crossover episode with Booked on Planning, and we had those folks on, which was really nice over Thanksgiving. Gave us a little bit of a break. And then coming up maybe around Christmas time, we're going to have a crossover episode with Transit Unplugged, which is another podcast that focuses on transit and talking with really cool people. I think the guest is going to be Randy Clark on that show, so we'll have that on here as well. And because we don't usually do a show every Monday, I'm thinking about maybe replaying some older episodes that people have liked again. I'm not getting rid of the Monday show, but every other Monday there's nothing in that slot, and so maybe that's a good spot for some replay episodes. And I know that we have a ton of new listeners that haven't heard a lot of the episodes from back in the day, at least over the last 10 years or so. So we'll be sharing maybe some flashbacks on Mondays in those slots where we aren't going to do a Monday show if I can find a bit of time to get them prepped. So I was actually just listening to Carol Martin's episode again today, and I was like, man, this is so great. And obviously it's one of my favorite episodes. I played as a bonus episode at Christmas a couple of years ago, and I just really like that one, and maybe we'll share that one again, but maybe not. But there's so many episodes that we've done. Obviously we're at 461 episodes now of Talking Headways coming up this Thursday, but also we've done like 612 I think total episodes, so there's a lot in the archive that maybe some folks haven't listened to. And if you have listened to it and you want to listen to it again, that's great. But if you haven't listened to it, you get kind of exposed to some of the stuff we've done in the past that, for the most part, this podcast I feel like is pretty evergreen. So there's a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily time sensitive. Maybe the Monday show is more time sensitive than the Thursday's Talking Headways. But Talking Headways is a really great show for just kind of that evergreen content that we can talk about over and over again. And it's good to revisit some of that sometimes. Also, and this is really exciting for those of you in the Bay Area. if you're in San Francisco or can get up to San Francisco on Thursday the 14th, we're having a live recording of a show with John King of the SF Chronicle, talking about his book called Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities. We're really excited about this. This was helped to be set up by our friends at the Bay Area Regional Collaborative with Allison Brooks and folks there. And so we're really looking forward to going and having a live show. John's going to sign some books. I might bring some scarves. It's going to be fun, kind of a pre-Christmas discussion about the ferry building and what its importance is to San Francisco. I haven't gotten to the book yet, but I'll get there soon, and I'm looking forward to talking to John about it. I know that it's been all over the airwaves and all over press and print here in the Bay Area, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with John about it. And finally, I'm trying to get that Kingwood Greenbelt episode done. I will try to get it over Christmas, maybe. Again, I'm crossing my fingers that I can get that done, hopefully by the end of the year. But if not, then it will come soon. Again, I have a lot of recorded. I asked the little folks at the Rice Library to get me some information. So I have lots of old press clippings and things like that about the Greenbelts. And hopefully I can stitch them all together in an episode that you all enjoy. So lots of great episodes coming up. We've got that live show. Oh, I forgot to mention, actually, if you want to go to the live show at MTC headquarters on December 14th, Thursday, December 14th, you can actually RSVP for that, tinyurl.com/portaltalk. That's tinyurl.com/portaltalk. You can RSVP there and then come and check it out. Looking forward to seeing a lot of you folks there. I really appreciate if folks would come, and at the end we'll have a beer, and some folks, if they're interested, can get their book signed, and we'll have a really fun discussion. So yeah, tinyurl.com/portaltalk if you want to RSVP for that live show. Okay, well, here we are again at the ads. Thanks to everybody who's been ordering Bus and Bike scarves. We really appreciate it. We've had a really big flurry of orders recently, and as we get closer to Christmas, if you'd like to order, go to theoverheadwire.com, and if you want more than 5, we'll give you a 25% discount for Monday's listeners only. So I know that there's folks that like to listen to Talking Headways. I know that there's folks that like to listen to Mondays, but we're going to give folks that listen to the Monday show a little bonus because I know that you guys are the hardcore ones that really like the news and everything else. So email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you want to order 5 or more, and we'll give you a good discount on the scarves. We really appreciate it. And also, for those of you who want to support the show, even if you're not Patreon members or buying scarves, you can do it in a number of different ways. Go to the bookshop site. All of this stuff is in the show notes, obviously. You can links. And go to the bookshop site, get one of our Cars Are Cholesterol t-shirts. I think that's bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. You can also subscribe to the newsletter. That's a really helpful thing too. And listening to the ads before the show and after the show generally helps too. And listening to the show in general, so like you're doing now, really helps. So if you're listening to the show, you're helping out already. So I really appreciate that. So there's so many ways to support the show. We thank you for your continued listening and supporting and all of the ways that you do that. And so thank you very much, especially as we get closer to the end of the year and we, count our blessings. We appreciate that. And thank you again so much for listening. And bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. You can get any of the books where we've talked to the authors. Also, bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol if you want to get one of those Cars Are Cholesterol shirts, mugs, t-shirts, long sleeve shirts people have been ordering apparently lately that I've seen in the order category. So anything you want with one of those logos on it that Richard Wazinski designed. And also, if you get a chance, check out Richard's Instagram page, Dick David Sketches. It's amazing, and he's got a lot of really cool robot drawings and stuff, and kind of, sets off the Cars Are Cholesterol vibe to me anyways. So yeah, make sure you get one of the shirts. Get the purple one. That's my favorite. So this is episode 144. We're live in session with you, and happy to have you here. And as always, as I tell people, you can always get the show on your podcatcher of choice. Most of you are probably already listening on podcatchers because I don't advertise this show as much as I maybe should, but you can find this podcast and Talking Headways wherever you find your podcasts: iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Cast, and of course, Apple Podcast. Sorry to the Stitcher listeners who will have seen their service disappear. Again, you're probably listening to this on another podcatcher by now, but I'm still just kind of sad about that because the Stitcher folks reached out really early when they were just starting out and hooked us up and set us up on there. So I appreciate them and looking forward to seeing what they do next. And also, if you feel so inclined, you can leave us a review on iTunes. We have lots of awesome reviews on there, but it's been a few years for some of them. So if you get a chance, we'd love your feedback as well. Okay, well, so let's get to what you're here for, which is the news. Here are the few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. As you know, we do a newsletter every single day when we're not on vacation anyways, and which is very rarely, unfortunately. I should probably take more time off. But yeah, so we do a newsletter, and as you all probably know, we go through about 1,500 items every single day, and we pull out the 40 to 50 that I think are the most interesting in 5 different topic categories, including transportation, urban design, urban issues like housing, environment as it pertains to cities, and research papers. So you get all of that in a nice little package every morning. I do 7 hours of work, so you only have to do 10 minutes of reading. I think it's a wonderful service, and I hopeful that people appreciate it as well. And actually, I just did a survey on there. I got a lot of responses, which was really great, and I got a really good feedback, which was nice too. And so hopefully we'll keep on continuing that service and keep it going. And that's basically the underpinning for this news section of Mondays and some of the other things that we do. So here are a few of the news items that were popular in the Overhead Wire Daily in the last few weeks. Motor emissions could have fallen more. A report by the Global Fuel Economy Initiative found that between 2010 and 2022, global emissions fell 4.2%. But if cars had not increased in size during that period, the number would have been more like 30%. SUVs are now 51% of the new car market, and the increasing size of vehicles means more energy is needed to propel them. This was by Helena Horton in The Guardian. This is a really important point. If we hadn't had all these growing vehicles, we would have likely dropped actually our emissions from transportation because of all of the electrification that's happening of fuel sources and people buying electric cars, but also the electrification of vehicles more generally. The size of vehicles has actually been going up, and so that means more fuel is needed to propel them. And it's the same thing for when we do that electric vehicle transition too. You're going to need more electrons to power some of these huge vehicles that are coming out. So the size and bigness of trucks and SUVs growing over time is actually a little bit of a problem from that perspective, from an emissions reduction standpoint. So that's something that we'll keep an eye on. But it's interesting to see that would have been 30%, but it only fell 4.2%. And leading the way in that category of transportation overall is these 3-wheelers and 2-wheelers in all over the world. And I think that we don't give enough credit to some of the countries who have actually been electrifying those much faster than we are electrifying our fleets here in the United States. So interesting to watch that. Overcoming car dependence. In Europe and around the world, the fundamentals of good cities are incompatible with car orientation, mostly due to the large amount of space required to accommodate vehicles. Dr. Philip Rode argues that the fights over transportation are also politically tricky, and shifting to a more car-centric transportation policy will hinge on perceptions of fairness by the wider public. When a policy can be framed by the opposition as quote-unquote unfair, it makes implementation much harder. This was by Philip Rode in LSE Cities, the London School of Economics. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, we are seeing a lot of these political fights because a lot of folks who, basically are drivers or see the restrictions as restrictions on them personally, see it as quote unquote unfair. Whether that's true or not is another matter, but their perception of it is that it is unfair to them. That's just something that I think really we have to pay attention to when we're making a lot of these decisions and discussions about whether we take away bike lanes or whether we take away parking spaces or give bike lanes, I should say, and take away parking spaces. And we're seeing this here in the Bay Area too, on Valencia. People talk about the bike lane. Whether you like or dislike the center running bike lane, I don't believe that it's the reason why a lot of these, owners of businesses along the corridor have been, having trouble attracting people. That's actually another interesting discussion I would want to have at some point is like, San Francisco is really hard to, move into now. The rent prices are way higher than they were, especially when I moved here. And what happens is, I think, is that you shut out some younger people that will actually patronize some businesses like bars and things like that. So people are going to blame the bike lane or blame something they can see. But the unseen thing is the amount of housing that's not happening and the amount of people that can't go to a bar or the amount of people that can't live in a neighborhood to patronize a business. And so I think that's a bigger discussion. But also, those folks are blaming the bike lane, and then the print media is actually, parroting that, even though this one place down there who blames the bike lane actually had a flood in the basement that basically took away all of their business for live music events. And so it's kind of disingenuous to say it's the bike lane when it is actually a big flood that happened in your building. But ultimately, this is something that I think Philip hits the nail on the head. People that see things as unfair are going to get upset and they're going to raise opposition. And actually, that's a big barrier to implementing some of the sustainable transportation features that we want to see over time. Okay, next up. America's weird mortgages. The 30-year mortgage isn't standard around the world. It's causing some of the problems in the current U.S. housing market as people stay put to keep their interest rates low as prices continue to rise and supply remains short. The current system, which allows owners to refinance their mortgage when rates are low, benefits homeowners and creates demand for housing, but a similar stimulus on the supply side doesn't exist, leaving a shortage. This is by Ben Castleman in the New York Times. It's interesting. When I read this article, I was thinking about it. Basically buyers get all the upside and limited downside, which, in most instances, I feel like that would be fair, especially from a business perspective. Buyers are kind of the winners. But then at the same time, it's a nice gig if you can get it. All this builds up inequality over time because of those who have been frozen out actually of the market, of the buyer's market, because you can't afford a house or because over time you haven't been able to get into this system that we've created. I don't know if it's the best system. The housing system in the United States is the best system because of how, basically extracts people's money over time. It does build, nest eggs and it builds wealth for people, but that's only if you can get in. So there's this kind of bifurcated, trail that people go along in their life, and if you can get into the housing market and the way that's structured in the United States, it's actually a good thing. But for you personally, but if you're just a renter and you can't get in because you can't afford it, then you're stuck renting, and rents go up over time while people's mortgages stay flat. The fixed costs stay flat over that 30-year time, and then they can refinance, maybe it even gets lower. So you see two different systems for renters and owners, and if everybody can't own a home, that seems like a little bit unfair. And it changes in other countries apparently, according to this article, which is really fascinating. Looking at how some of the rates actually change over a few years period. It's not just the people who are buying houses new that are facing the problems. It's actually the people who are all mortgage owners at the time. So the rates actually flex a little bit at different parts of the timeline for folks in different countries. And so I found that really interesting. I hope folks can get a chance to read it. Again, all these links that I'm posting and talking about will be in the show notes, as they always are. I know folks appreciate that because then they can go read the article, because it gives more detail than I could ever give in a couple of minutes time talking over it on the show. But yeah, there's really interesting stuff in there, and hopefully folks can check it out and take a read. Next up, Mayo Clinic unveils Health Neighborhoods Plan. The Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota is planning a $5 billion campus that creates health neighborhoods to link different types of services together so people aren't traveling between multiple buildings for care. Now, instead of individual floors being created for services like testing and blood work or surgery, the areas would be flexible based on patient care needs. The program is also part of Rochester's 20-year Medical Center Economic Development Plan, which features a new bus rapid transit line, new zoning rules, and commercial development. This was by Catherine Reichert in NPR News, MPR, Minnesota Public Radio. I'm really fascinated by this. And the reason why is because, earlier this year, we actually posted something and shared it probably on the Monday show, an idea from Heatherwick studio about using vacant storefronts on commercial streets to create these health districts with different spaces serving different health needs and focusing on things like exercise and well-being and things like that. And it definitely feels like there's a lot of room for this type of discussion in the healthcare space about how urban design impacts place, but not just like the design of an individual building, but the design of a district overall. So if you've ever gone to like a Kaiser, for example, here in the Bay Area, that you go to your doctor and then they send you downstairs to do a blood test, and then they send you upstairs to do an MRI, and then they send you to the basement to do this other thing, and going up and down. And then some places around the country, it's actually that you send it to another building in the complex. And so to get care, you're moving all over the place, which, if you're immunocompromised or if you're not feeling great, it's not the most, the best journey. And for example, the Mayo Clinic specifically, the reason why they're designing it this way is because they get a lot of patients that come and stay for actually a long period of time because they have multiple ailments, or they have real serious ailments that actually require them to go to their, whether it's cancer or something along those lines. So actually creating a system where the care is all somewhat in the same place rather than making people go back and forth between buildings is actually kind of revolutionary, I feel like, especially from the perspective of the patient. So it's really interesting to see what they're doing and how they're doing it. I hope at some point I get to talk to the folks who are working on this, because it's kind of like a thinking about access and transportation, right? It's along those same lines. And so, if we're thinking about healthcare this way and we're thinking about public health this way, how can we think about accessing other things this way? And how can we combine things from a building perspective or from a campus perspective that brings all of these ideas from healthcare together? So there's something here. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is that we can learn to bring over to the transportation space, aside from, bringing people, what they need and having access to the things that they need in a closer proximity. But there's something there, and I'll try to tease it out as soon as I can, and share with you all. Of course, that's what we do. Okay, next up, can Charlotte resort itself? A year after passing a momentous zoning reform by a narrow margin, Charlotte, North Carolina continues to rehash fights over development, equity, and racism. The Unified Development Ordinance would get rid of single-family detached zoning, but council members opposed to the changes are looking to restrict the densities allowed by the hard-fought reforms. This article is by Andy Thomason in the Assembly, NC. Really interesting thinking about this. They passed it, and then they had an election, and then there's people on the council who didn't like it, so they're rehashing all of the issues with getting rid of the zoning that allows for multiple homes. Allows for only a single house versus allowing for multiple homes. I'm trying to figure out the language around that, right? Because Jenny Schutz at recently said, let's not call it, getting rid of single family zoning, because it's not really getting rid of single family zoning. It's more like allowing more development on a single parcel. And so the language about it is kind of difficult to parse and discuss in that way, because it is drilled into you to talk about things in the negative way, what you're taking away instead of what you're giving people, which is kind of a language thing. But and it's similar to that discussion earlier about fairness that we were talking about transportation. So I feel like this is really interesting because of the arguments that they're having, the same arguments and similar arguments that people are having all over the country about single-family zoning writ large. As well, in Minneapolis, they're having the same discussion too, about whether the 2040 plan should go forward and whether the processes were correct, and who benefits and who is a loser in the situation. So yeah, I just found this article really interesting because it comes at it from the Charlotte perspective, from another state that we don't hear about as much when it comes to housing. I mean, obviously, folks that are living there hear about it all the time, but it's not something that's necessarily in the national media. Not that the Assembly NC is actually national media, but it's something that I picked up, and hopefully, folks will get a chance to read it if they want to learn actually more about kind of the divisions that are happening in Charlotte over this specific policy. Okay, next up. Is the land value tax idea back? Detroit's Mayor Mike Duggan is one of the few leaders in the country considering a land value tax to raise rates on vacant land and lower them on parcels with occupied structures. Interestingly enough, he hadn't heard of Georgism, but the hope with implementation is that more equitable system emerges where speculation is reduced and redevelopment is rewarded. The only stumbling block now is getting the state of Michigan to let them do it. This was by our friend Connor Doherty in the New York Times. I was recently in Boston for a day and a half at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and we listened to a lot of speakers talk about land use, housing issues over the time that we were there. And one of the folks that spoke was Jay Rising, who was the CFO of Detroit. And I thought that he gave some actual little bit of details about things that were actually pertinent to this discussion. Particularly, one of them is that 10 private owners actually own more than 2,500 parcels in the city of Detroit. And they buy them up kind of like lottery tickets and pay next to nothing in property taxes. So maybe they have 1,000 properties or something like that, or 500 properties. They only pay $25 per property per year, something along those lines. And so the idea is to actually make them pay more while lowering the burden for other property holders who are lower income and probably looking for a little bit of relief. And so if the scheme is implemented, the vacant land tax will triple the amount that people will be paying if they have vacant properties. So, you might not be paying $25, maybe paying $75, which is a pittance still, but it actually balances out the impacts from people who own homes, who are keeping up their homes, who are actually, living in the neighborhoods and taking care of their neighborhoods as they live there. So I think this is a really important discussion to have, especially if we have this discussion about a national flip to land value taxes instead of the tax system that we have now. Here in California, obviously it's tricky with Prop 13. that restricts land values, or I should say property taxes to 1979 levels, or whenever you purchase a property, then you kind of get flatline, which is nice for putting your property tax in amber to a certain extent. But it's also not necessarily fair, because there's a lot of people who are paying a lot less in property tax than maybe you are if you're if you just bought a house. So there might be a house that's next to one house might be worth they're both two houses next to each other, probably maybe both are worth a couple $1 million. One is paying $25,000 in taxes a year. The other one is paying $2,000 to $5,000 in taxes a year. I don't know if that's exactly fair from a certain perspective. It definitely helps people stay in their homes for a longer period of time, and I appreciate that. There's a lot of other benefits to that for older homeowners and maybe low-income homeowners, maybe folks with fixed incomes whose incomes don't rise necessarily as fast as property taxes would. But at the same time, there's a huge difference in what people are paying versus what people are paying now versus what they were paying then, and the differences are increasing. And a land value tax could actually take care of that in a way that's, I think, feel like more equitable. It's an interesting article by Connor. I hope folks get a chance to take it out, check it out in the show notes, to click on it if you get a chance. Okay, so we also have some bonus items too. These are a few of the items that we like to share with folks that weren't super popular on the newsletter. I mean, that by saying that, I mean that they just weren't clicked on as much as the other ones, but there are probably some that were popular or weren't as popular, but they just didn't make the top list. But just a few bonus items that I thought were interesting, and hopefully folks will find interesting as well. So a NASA scientist was surprised by the findings that this year's El Nino was likely to be historically strong, culminating in severe rain events and flooding on the West Coast in the first few months of 2024. The weather pattern could cause up to 5 10-year storms and coastal high tide flooding. This was in Newsweek. So climate change, man, heating up, causing El Ninos. Reminds me of that Chris Farley sketch every time. Yo soy El Nino. El Nino is Spanish for the Nino. Really funny. Anyways, if you get a chance, go to El Nino SNL Chris Farley. You'll find it on YouTube or something like that. But anyways, a little comic relief there. Anyways, the problem here is that we're going to see a rash of historically bad storms. The good news is that it was going to bring a lot of water and refreshment to California and to Washington State and to Oregon after several years of drought, lower rainfall, I shouldn't say drought, lower rainfall levels and high levels of forest fires and things like that. But at the same time, it might only be fleeting. I mean, these are cycles. And so, we get a lot of rain in certain years, and then we go drought in other years. And so it's frustrating to kind of parse that out. But the damage that can be caused by some of these storms is quite immense. Last year, I think we had one of those in San Francisco where we had an atmospheric river and it dropped like 5 inches of rain in one day. And, our basement got water in it because it was flooding down from the front of the house. And it's something that almost never happens otherwise in any other rain. It's just something that happens specifically when there's a ton of it. And so I feel like that there's a lot of places that are going to be feeling that flooding as soon as these atmospheric rivers get going. And so if a NASA scientist is surprised at the severity of these, I imagine that they're going to be pretty rough, and people should really be getting ready for them now. I have boards that I put over the flower box in the front because I know that's where the water comes from, and hopefully to stem the water. But it's just so much water. There's sometimes there's not much you can do about it when it's coming down. Next up, after getting rid of e-scooters in the center of Paris, Mayor Anne Hidalgo has set her sights on a new referendum focused on getting heavy vehicles like SUVs to pay more for parking. If it happens, it would likely pass as very few residents of Paris drive the huge vehicles. This is in the BBC. Going after parking, making people park, pay by weight impacts. I think that's a really interesting idea, and let's see what Paris does, because I think if Paris does it, it's going to be implemented in other places. Another thing, that was recently, there's a Politico item about Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London, and kind of watching his steps with the low emission zones that he's created in London. And obviously, there's been a lot of fervor politically over those, and national politics and stuff in England discussing those things, and he's gotten a lot of guff about it. But it's interesting to see, kind of how people are watching him and Mayor Anne Hidalgo and the former mayor of Barcelona and things like that, about how much when they do something, people are watching to see if they can actually do it as well. And so I feel like if Mayor Hidalgo actually goes through with this, I think you'll see a lot of copycats. The same way that I think if Sadiq Khan gets reelected in London, that you'll probably see a lot more people maybe going after the low emission zone. And it's coming from a good place. I mean, he's talking about childhood asthma. He's talking about, air pollution, air quality, creating problems for people who breathe the air in central London. And they've reduced actually particulates and, nitrous oxide emissions in the city through their processes and through the congestion charge and things like that. So really interesting to think about how the mayors really have a big impact on what happens in other cities around the world, not just their own. People are walking less after more intense years of the pandemic, and Linda Poon suggests that it's for several reasons. First off is that roads are more dangerous and safety is an issue, but other reasons include more home deliveries by e-commerce companies. Much of the reduction in walking is for commutes, as recreational walking has increased. This is in Marketplace. Yeah, so I guess we had a lot of people walking for commutes, and that's decreased as people were working home from maybe a couple of days a week. And so you're seeing a lot of reduced walking. I don't know exactly how they get these data points, but it's interesting to think about. I think it's probably like their streetlight data or some of the cell phone companies, which are going to be cut off at some point. Karen Chappell actually talked about this at the MPAC conference, where some of her data that she uses for measuring the vibrancy of downtowns is going to disappear as privacy methods are implemented on phones, which is a great thing. But at the same time, I'd like to give Karen Chappell my data. I don't want it to go to other people, but I'd like to give it to Karen Chappell for her research. So it would be nice to actually pick and choose who you could give the data to for people who are discussing this specific thing that it's in Marketplace. Thinking about walking data, I'd love to give my information about that. I don't want it to give it to some crazy company that's just going to strip mine it for value. That's just my personal opinion. But so it's interesting to see how walking has decreased because of the pandemic from a workplace perspective. I feel like it's going to come back at some point, just because people are going to have to go get places, and they're not just going to spend time at home. I know that for me, I don't walk up and down the hill as much as I did, because I'm not going to BART and not going to work in Oakland when I started working from home in about 2014. But I do find that I walk a lot more to get basic things or go, shopping or things like that. This weekend went to the farmer's market. That type of stuff happens more often now. And so I feel like that there's something that's going to get replaced, and it'll all even out in the end. But hopefully we can promote walking a little bit more. Okay, the Biden administration is finalizing a plan to have states and MPOs measure transportation emissions and set goals to reduce them. The regulations are unlikely to have teeth or consequences given the legislative fights over the issue during the infrastructure and inflation bills, but will set benchmarks going forward. This was in Route 50. FHWA Administrator Shaylin Batt, who used to be at ITS America, I believe, stressed, and actually a guest on the show at some point in the past, stressed that state DOTs and MPOs won't be penalized for missing their targets. That's okay for now, because I feel like if you set the targets, you'd get a bunch of noise from state DOTs and legislators and people who are upset about measuring things. I don't know why they're upset about measuring greenhouse gas emissions. Well, I can't actually guess. But at least now that there's an idea to have a target. And in the future, if there are, if it is needed to reduce emissions, then you have these, basic numbers that you can show how many emissions you had in the state, and then you can show how you can lower them. Or you have the data to, kind of show how much, you're causing, whether it's particulates or air pollution or anything along those lines. It'd be good to just at least have those numbers and take that data, because if you start taking it now, then you'll have it as a historical thing. It's like the census, right? We have all this data from the census going back to the 1700s when the census started, but it wouldn't even be there to be compared against unless you had the starting point at all. So it'd be good to have that data start. And I know, there's a lot of frustrated people about it because they didn't want it in the Inflation Reduction Act or the transportation bill, but ultimately you're going to have to take them at some point. You're going to have to take data, and you can use it to actually make a case one way or another in the future. So at least there's a target. At least they're going to be collecting data. I'm all about it. Native Americans have won several court cases over salmon habitat and tribal fishing rights in Washington state that will require the Department of Transportation to build more fish-friendly culverts under roads. add inflation and other pressures, and the DOT budget could increase by over $7 billion to reestablish habitat. This was in the Seattle Times. Yeah, so we talked about this in Ben Goldfarb's book and his discussion that we had on his book Crossings. Really interesting to think about how much this is actually going to impact the Washington State DOT's budget and how much they're on the hook for because of legal reasons. For $7 billion is a lot to reestablish salmon habitat. It's interesting that they're actually going to go through with it. I hope they don't try to negotiate it down or anything like that. But, it's interesting. Some of these natural habitats that we've messed up with roads, really, it's possible to recreate them or put them back together again. And we'll see what happens with this one specifically. A strong market in the United States has businesses everywhere looking for workers, but they're having a hard time finding them because of lack of affordable housing. Some business owners have taken it upon themselves to house workers, but the longer the housing shortage persists, the more it is likely to distort the job market. So I think this is true. You set up a system where people are short on housing, and so you can't find the workers you need for the lower paying jobs. And, it starts to get people to move to different places where they can't afford housing, and then it distorts the market because of the transportation gaps. And so I think all these things are connected, obviously, but it's interesting to hear about, what people are doing now to deal with it, but what they're not doing, right? They're not doing that supply side thing that we were talking about earlier with the mortgage discussion in the 30-year mortgage with the New York Times article. And I think that that's something I didn't talk about earlier that I probably should have, but there is that distortion. There is there's the demand side subsidies for mortgages to get a 30-year mortgage to create the need to, create the ability to purchase homes. But there hasn't been a supply side situation where you're actually supplying the houses that people need to live. And so if you only have one side of that, it gets distorted pretty easily. And I think that's part of the problem here. And, it's really part of a problem of larger labor markets and trying to get people to live places and work places, et cetera. So again, I know I say this a lot. I've been saying this a lot. Oh, it's interesting. But it is. It really is something that we should be paying attention to because all these things are tied together. The housing market, the transportation system as it connects people to places and the work that they need to do. Ultimately, if it's not, on balance, it's going to be messed up. And I'm not talking about the traditional idea of jobs housing balance. I think there's something about that's kind of, not quite connected to reality. But there should be a balance in the sense that people should be able to get to places and work that it's available, because there's places where there's a lot of available jobs, but not a lot of available housing. So there's a transportation gap there and needs to be sorted, whether that's building new housing or building better transportation. I'm not sure, but it's a distortion that's happening and continuing to happen as we continue to grow as a country. A couple more here. In San Diego, a city ordinance piggybacking on the state housing law allows landowners to build multiple quote-unquote ADUs on a property. Through some fancy maneuvering, the rules have resulted in some instances where developers have constructed multi-unit apartment buildings up to 36 units that fit the language of the law. This was by Ben Christopher and CalMatters. I want to read actually what Ben wrote, a couple paragraphs, because I think it's really fascinating how this gets from being just a backyard ADU to 36 units. So here's the quote. The city's one-of-a-kind ordinance offers landlords a one-for-one deal. If they agree to construct an ADU and keep the rent low enough for San Diegans making under a certain income, they're automatically permitted to build a second bonus unit, which they can rent at whatever price they like. In parts of the city far from public transit, the 2021 city program offers a one-off alongside the main house and the two ADUs already permitted under state law. The city allows for a maximum of 5 units on one property. So basically, if you take all these little properties and you can multiply them up, you can actually add up parcels to make basically apartment complexes and call them ADUs. It's something that state law allows. I just find this really fascinating because it's basically kind of subverting the idea of an ADU as being this kind of casita that sits in somebody's backyard and actually discusses, more missing middle housing of 4 or 5 unit buildings, 2 to 3 unit buildings, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, those types of things. So it's interesting to see how San Diego has kind of stepped around the law and made people mad, obviously. But if this is, copied in other places, it could be really, really interesting. Okay. A library in Santa Barbara is renting out e-bike share memberships so people can try them out and see if they like riding them. The library has partnered with B-Cycle, which has 250 e-bikes in docks around the city, and set up 10 memberships that can be rented out for a week at a time. This is a great idea. So basically, the library is a holder of 10 memberships. They can rent them out for a week so people can try e-bikes and then see if they like them. They can buy an e-bike, or actually they can eventually get their own membership to B-Cycle. And so I think that that's really cool. And I like that the library is working on this and kind of partnering to rent out a public good to a certain extent. So that's really cool. Good on you, Library of Santa Barbara. Programs totaling over $118 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act will now have clear environmental justice goals, with 40% of funds needing to be invested in disadvantaged communities, according to documents from the Biden administration. The Justice 40 initiative was initiated by the president with the signing of an executive order in 2021. This was in The Verge. And so basically, that's it for today. I thought I had another one, but I guess I don't. Oh, actually, no, I do have another one. Ha ha ha. One more. In Houston, transportation officials are starting to reflect the diversity of the region as a whole. Once a space for white male engineers, transportation planners in the region are starting to have much more varied experiences and backgrounds, and advocates hope that means a future that is much more multimodal than the current auto-centric model in the city. This was in the Houston Chronicle. So I guess going back to both of those last items, it's good to have new blood thinking about transportation policy and varied experiences too. A lot of these folks, lived in other countries and lived in other cities where they saw the transportation points that worked and didn't work. And so you can bring that experience to a place like Houston, which has, its own kind of quirkiness and interest, but it's also really cool to see that there's some diversity coming through as well. And I really like that, the executive order pushes on, investing in communities that are, disadvantaged. And, people were mad that the disadvantaged communities definition doesn't include race because it wasn't allowed to for some reason. But I think that they'll try and figure out a way to get to make sure that people who are impacted by whether it's climate change or other, lack of funding because of their stature, they'll actually get more access to funds, and maybe more than they would have in the first place, which is a good start to start thinking about, environmental justice, equity, and making sure that people get investments that need the investments and not necessarily because they have connections. Okay. So as I always say, there's a lot of awesome articles I didn't get to share with you all because we don't have enough time, obviously, to go through them all every week, or every 2 weeks, I should say. But these are the news items we share in our newsletter, and we've archived every single link since 2013 and tagged them by topic and city in our archive. It's an amazing knowledge tool, and if you want to check it out, again, you can sign up for a free trial of the newsletter. I know I can tell you all to sign up every week, but if you haven't, you should, because we share so much information, and I find it can be really helpful. I'm also trying to think of ways to kind of coordinate the information a little bit better so that we are kind of making sure that if you're looking for something specific, you can get there, and maybe we have topic tags or things like that can bring general topics to the fore and share those. So I'm thinking about that a little bit more. But yeah, if you haven't already, I know most of you probably signed up for the newsletter if you're listening to this episode of Mondays. But if you haven't already, definitely take a look. And if you're not a newsletter person and that's why you're listening to this podcast, I totally appreciate that. This is our 612th episode between both shows, Talking Headways and Mondays, and we really want to keep it going. So one way to do that is through subscribing to the newsletter and keep that going as well, so we can keep bringing you news on this show. So thanks for listening and supporting. We really appreciate it, as always. Yeah. So I guess that's where I just say, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without you. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. We appreciate it here at Talking Headways. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during this pandemic that's been over 3 years. So we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you our transportation scarf of choice and a handwritten note as well. I'll do that for folks who are supporting us at that level. And I've got scarves here ready to go. So feel free to do that anytime you wish. Also, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1999 classic Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one or listen to it, go to raymondunwin.com. Next up, listener questions and comments. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears. Email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. You can also find us on Threads and Mastodon and still Twitter, although Twitter might die soon. I don't know. We'll see. Puppies and Butterflies is part of the show where we just talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections, really starting to feel like the holidays. It hasn't really been cold yet, but I like that the holiday decorations are around, and I'm looking forward to making cookies and other things and thinking about Christmas and spending time with family. I just really like this time of year, and my wife and I have been listening to Christmas music every night to get into the mood, and I think it's working. Although a lot of the songs are played over and over again. They're kind of the same, but that's okay. It's only once a month, 1 month, although she does get it stuck in her head throughout the year, so that's okay too. Okay, you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or theoverheadwire.com. You can find me on Mastodon at The Overhead Wire at sfba.social. You can find me on Threads at The Overhead Wire and Instagram at The Overhead Wire, which is a little bit more of a personal one because I just post kind of vacation pictures and that stuff. But I do post from time to time. If you are on Instagram, I do post from time to time in my stories. I post when a podcast comes out or something like that. So check those out if you get a chance. And thanks for joining us at Mondays at the Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thank you all for listening and supporting. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you next time.
Talk